as the numbers tick up and people are starting to log in. The number of people. All right, I'm going to get started and let people log in as they can. So welcome everybody to this press conference and public launch of the growing regional coalition, New England for Offshore Wind. My name is Susanna Hatch, and I am the Clean Energy Coalition Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts. Thank you all for being here today. A few housekeeping notes before we kick things off. First, this event is being recorded, as you can see, and it's live streaming on Facebook. So if you do not wish to be filmed, please make sure to turn off your cameras. And please stay on mute unless you have been invited to speak. We will have 8 people from different sectors speak, including New England for Offshore Wind partners, as well as advocates and supporters of offshore wind who are not part of the coalition. We will have time for questions after the speaking portion of the event. We received a few questions ahead of time from some of you, and we'll be happy to take questions live as well, either in the chat box or verbally. So to kick things off, we'll show a 1-minute video about the benefits of offshore wind and why it's a game changer for New England. So I hope you all enjoyed that video. A longer, more in-depth version of the video is available on our coalition website, newenglandforoffshorewind.org, should any of you like to see that. So kicking off the speaking portion of our remarks, New England for Offshore Wind is a growing regional coalition of 40 environmental advocacy organizations, academic and research institutions, justice and health organizations, business alliances, and labor unions. Coalition partners and endorsers hail from all 6 New England states and will be working together to advocate at the state and regional levels. We aim to drive governors and legislatures to support regional collaboration and more offshore wind procurements, building the political will to power every home in New England with offshore wind. We also aim to build public support to enable offshore wind projects to come online in a timely and responsible manner. We have been building the coalition over the past few months while working as an alliance of organizations, driving testimony to the recent federal hearings and comment period. And today, as a formal coalition, we will be sending a letter to the 6 New England governors, urging them to issue a joint resolution in support of creating a shared vision and driving regional collaboration on offshore wind. Regional collaboration is a necessary precondition for attaining New England's potential as an offshore wind leader. The New England for Offshore Wind Coalition members are proud of the early individual state procurements in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And we also see clearly that deeper regional collaboration will unlock economies of scale, accelerate development, and improve project outcomes across the 6-state grid that we share. Offshore wind is our region's best opportunity for new sources of energy. It is the single biggest lever we can pull to reduce emissions, address the climate crisis, and grow the economy at the same time. Offshore wind also creates significant health benefits to residents living near fossil fuel power plants, a disproportionate number of whom are people of color. As offshore wind comes online, dirty power plants will switch off, eliminating a leading cause of air pollution in overburdened communities. Around 1/6 to 1/3 of New England's old fossil fuel power plants will likely retire over the next decade per our grid operator, ISO New England. And it is imperative that we fill this gap with clean energy. Offshore wind can get us there and can power our buildings and our transportation systems with clean energy as we electrify. The economic development potential and cost are both compelling for offshore wind, particularly in this time of severe economic downturn. Bringing offshore wind to the scale needed to combat climate change would marshal over $100 billion in private capital and create tens of thousands of jobs across the region. As the cost continues to decline, offshore wind will save ratepayers billions of dollars over the terms of their contracts. And of course, we believe strongly in environmental and wildlife protection. With thorough input from experts and the best available science, offshore wind can be sited and developed in a responsible manner that protects wildlife and habitat. Climate change is the leading threat to wildlife, fisheries, and the environment, which is why we believe that offshore wind energy should advance as quickly as the responsible development allows. So now I'll welcome the next speakers on the program. Next up is New Hampshire State Senator David Waters.
Well, thank you, Susanna, and good morning, everyone. A lot of us come to offshore wind because of the climate crisis, but we stay for the jobs and lower energy costs. In New Hampshire, the climate crisis is going to hit us, particularly with sea level rise on our vulnerable coasts, but we also have historically high energy costs. And so offshore wind will lower energy costs, provide jobs, and also could power our transportation sector as well. If you've seen the Wood Mackenzie report on the economic impacts of Gulf of Maine wind power, it's quite dramatic. We might have 9 gigawatts of offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, and this means 20,000 jobs in development, construction, and then ongoing operation and maintenance out to 2050, turbine manufacturing and supply chain, transportation and port industries, and general services. Now, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Task Force for the Gulf of Maine really requires and envisions cooperation among Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, but I think the potential here is for cooperation with all 6 New England states, because we face really challenges of workforce development, energy supply, and transmission. In New Hampshire, this is one of those rare energy issues that the governor and the legislature are all on board together. The governor, Sununu, established his energy task force, and the legislature passed, and he signed my Senate Bill 668, part of the omnibus House Bill 1245, which will set up a commission for offshore wind to bring all the players together so we can attract this industry here. I've just mentioned the potential for New Hampshire cooperating with Maine and Massachusetts to be a hub for the Gulf of Maine industry. We have our state pier, Peace Development Authority, a great airport facility. We have the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, a deep water berth on the ocean side of Seaview Island. We're going to have an expanded turning basin in the Piscataqua, and also great potential for onshoring the energy and the infrastructure required for that, with additional land that is deep water. Also, if hydrogen becomes part of this, which I think it's likely to do based on what's happening in Europe, there are also great facilities for use of hydrogen as energy storage and for power. But I think we need to cooperate now on many areas. In southern New England, some of the port facilities and manufacturing and staging areas are kind of getting to be at capacity, and there's no reason why we couldn't begin in Maine and New Hampshire to provide space for this industry, which is then going to develop in more prominently in our region. I think in particularly, we're going to have to cooperate on workforce development. I know that Massachusetts is working with Maine Maritime, and Connecticut and Rhode Island are also trying to address the needs identified for this workforce. And in New Hampshire, we really need to, and have interest in a kind of a cooperation agreement among Great Bay Community College and the Career and Technical Education centers. You know, it's programs in welding, in electricity, it's programs in steam fitting and pipe fitting, but also in dives, and also health programs because of all the general services, or even catering. So we've got a big challenge to get those 20,000 workers, so there'll be New England workers and not brought in from overseas. I think finally I'd like to say that we need to take steps in these areas right now. And also really, as Susanna mentioned, there's extraordinary potential here to address long-standing issues of economic, racial, and health equity in our region through clean energy of offshore wind. Well, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Waters. Next up is Dr. Sanjay Arwady from the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Thank you, Susanna. I am speaking to all of you from Amherst, where I'm a professor of civil engineering and a member of the faculty of the Wind Energy Center at UMass Amherst. It's really an honor to be speaking at this kickoff of the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, which ELM has so capably organized. The UMass Amherst Wind Energy Center is the longest running wind energy research and education center in the country. And our founder, William Hieronymus, published the first paper suggesting the potential of offshore wind. Among other things, we're home to a new NSF-funded graduate traineeship program that will educate more than 40 graduate students to drive the coming clean energy transition. We're proud to be able to support this coalition for offshore wind in New England and believe that our power as a coalition comes from the breadth of the member groups and institutions, demonstrating the wide and overwhelming support for offshore wind in New England. As our friends in New York and the Mid-Atlantic step up their efforts in offshore wind, the time is right for New England to assert itself even more forcefully. Through bold political leadership and activism, New England has positioned itself as a leader nationally in the race to develop offshore wind energy as our most powerful tool to transition to a clean, renewable, and equitable energy future. At the same time, New England's colleges and universities continue to lead the nation in research and education that is driving the industry forward and educating the workforce needed to make this a truly homegrown industry. This great work is happening in Maine, about which you will hear more later, throughout New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and even in landlocked Vermont. Here in Massachusetts, along with our strong community colleges, the Partnership for Offshore Wind Research, Power US Massachusetts, is a consortium consisting of the UMass System, Tufts, Northeastern, and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute that conducts research and education totaling tens of millions of dollars in support of offshore wind across engineering, social and political science, environmental conservation, regional planning, and even more. New England's colleges and universities stand ready to do our part in ensuring that New England continues to lead the nation in putting offshore wind to use to ensure a clean, renewable, and equitable energy future. Thanks, Susanna, for the opportunity to speak this morning. Back to you.
Thanks, Sanjay. Next, we'll hear from Senna Wazer at Sunrise, Connecticut.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Good morning. My name is Senna Wazer, and I am a 16-year-old climate justice advocate and the co-director of Sunrise, Connecticut. I've been an advocate for the environment since I was 5 years old, and I'm here today because I'm fearful for my future, but also hopeful. We're on a tight timeline with only a decade left to prevent the worst consequences of the climate crisis. This crisis will not be solved with half solutions or lackluster policies. This crisis will only go away if we commit to doing everything in our power to make sure that we have a livable planet, a livable home, moving forward. And part of that solution, that commitment to the future, is offshore wind. Right now, the Northeast has an opportunity to be a leader. Connecticut has an opportunity to be a leader. In this time where federal leadership is so lacking, we can show the country and the world that we will continue to fight for a livable planet for my generation. We can begin to put the necessary policies and infrastructure in place, proving that we believe a better future is possible. And the beautiful thing about offshore wind, really any infrastructure necessary to combat climate change, is that it is not only a step to reducing our carbon emissions, but it also creates jobs. Jobs which are so sorely needed in the midst of COVID-19. Jobs that pay a living wage and allow people to live with dignity and respect. I could go on and on about the benefits of offshore wind, but what I really want to highlight today is why, in this moment, it is so critical that we not dally any longer, that we take drastic action to combat the climate crisis. Right now, as we speak, California is up in flames. Connecticut just weathered a very strong hurricane, resulting in long-lasting power outages. These natural disasters are fueled, made worse by the climate crisis. Climate change is not a joke. Climate change is not going to go away. Climate change is getting worse, and climate change is killing people right now. And the thing about climate change is that it doesn't impact everyone equally. Like COVID-19, climate change impacts Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income people first and the most heavily. Climate change threatens young people disproportionately, so that in 10 years, when I'm only 26 years old, I don't know if I'll have a safe planet to call home. I am afraid. I am afraid that the lack of action we have seen for so many years will end up destroying my generation's future, not to mention future generations. But that is also why I am so passionate, why I believe in offshore wind, why I believe that we can and will take the action necessary in the short amount of time we have. Offshore wind is the Northeast's first step towards a renewable energy future. And so I'm very grateful to be here today and to voice my very strong support and belief in the necessity and benefits of offshore wind to ensure that we take this first critical step towards a 100% renewable energy future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. Next up is Dr. Regina LaRocque of Mass General Hospital and of the Healthcare Without Harm Physician Network.
Thanks, Susanna, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with this amazing panel this morning. I'm speaking to you from Mass General Hospital. I'm an infectious disease physician and researcher and associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And I'm here today to speak in support of developing our offshore wind resources because I believe offshore wind is essential to preserving and protecting the health of all New Englanders. The extraction of fossil fuels and their combustion in vehicles and power plants and the leakage of natural gas from our aging infrastructure is releasing pollutants into our air. These pollutants include methane, toxic chemicals, ozone, and particulates, which is also known as soot. The medical science is clear that these air pollutants are associated with premature death and increased hospitalization rates. They cause diseases that we care for every day in our patients here at Mass General, like heart attacks, cancer, bronchitis, and asthma. The American Lung Association's State of the Air report in 2020 evaluated levels of ozone and particulate pollution across the US and found that almost half of Americans live in counties with unhealthy levels of these air pollutants. And these effects are being felt right here in Massachusetts. 9 counties in Massachusetts received a D or an F in the 2020 American Lung Association report. In 2019, Springfield, Massachusetts was deemed the asthma capital of the United States by the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America. And now during the COVID-19 pandemic, we infectious disease specialists are seeing emerging evidence that particulate air pollutants are supercharging the effects of the virus, since higher levels of exposure to particulate air pollution is associated with higher COVID-related death rates. This is a double injustice to the communities in our state, which are too often Black or brown, that live in the sacrifice zones near highways, compressor stations, and other polluting facilities. Aside from the direct impact on health, The combustion of fossil fuels is generating carbon emissions that are changing our planet in ways that are dangerous to all of us and increasingly apparent to all of us. The wildfires that are making the air in California unsafe to breathe, the storms that are threatening our coastal communities, and the heat waves that cause in excess of 12,000 deaths every year in the United States, particularly in the Northeast. The bottom line is this: we have to stop powering our homes, our businesses, and our hospitals by burning things. The combustion of fossil fuels is exerting a massive cost on our health. So I am here to join with my employer, Mass General Brigham, to say it's time to get to work, to start building a healthier and more equitable future for all of New England by expanding the offshore wind that's available to our region. Thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Dr. LaRocque. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Habib Dagher from the University of Maine. Is he still on? All right, we might need to switch around until he can reconnect.
Yes.
Oh, there he is. Okay.
Hello, this is Habib Dagher. I'm the director of the Composite Center at the University of Maine, and I've been working on floating offshore wind for 12 years. And the journey in Maine to look at offshore wind started when heating oil prices, if you recall, hit $4 a gallon, and gasoline prices hit $4 a gallon close to about 12 years ago. Maine was in a crisis mode at that point. The average family in Maine was paying close to $10,000 a year just to heat their home and to drive their cars. And that was more than 20% of the family's income was going to essentially paying for fossil fuels that we couldn't afford. So the University of Maine, working with the state, started looking at other ways to heat our homes and drive our cars. And we identified offshore wind as the biggest opportunity for us to do so. We put together a plan that was voted on by the legislature unanimously to move in the direction of offshore wind and put 5 gigawatts of offshore wind in the state of Maine to heat every home and drive every car. That was close to about a decade ago. And today, we are moving forward again in that direction with our governor's vision to become carbon neutral here over the next few decades. We also deployed the first floating wind turbine off the US coast back in 2013. It was grid connected off the coast of Castine, Maine. That technology is critical to the future of offshore wind in New England because we have deep waters off of our coast in New England. It's not just California that has deep waters, but the New England does too. More than 50% of New England's waters require floating wind turbines. In the state of Maine, more than 90% of our resource within 50 miles needs floating technologies. So together, we look forward to work with everyone here on developing floating technologies for New England that can be made in New England so we can keep the local jobs in New England for these technologies. In Maine, our technology that's been developed is called Volturnus. It's a concrete floating hull that can be fabricated locally, just like you build a bridge. The technology recently received a $100 million investment from the private sector, so we can, and $40 million from the DOE, so we can build the first floating demonstrator in the United States here in New England. And we call the project New England Aquaventus 1. We hope to have that in the water in 2023. So we look forward to work with all of you to start the journey of developing low-cost floating technologies needed for New England. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dagher. Next up, we'll hear from David Monty, a Rhode Island charter captain and recreational fisherman.
Thank you very, very much. I'd like to share that I am a charter captain. I do take people fishing for a living from a sport fishing perspective. And I'm active in the American Saltwater Guides Association on their board, as well as something called the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association, which has 7,500 members. I'm a vice president of that board. in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So it's great to be here to discuss two of my greatest passions, fishing and offshore wind. I believe that fishing and offshore wind can coexist, just as it has done at the Block Island Wind Farm, and I have firsthand experience fishing that wind farm and being with it since its development stage. At the Block Island Wind Farm, you should know that commercial gill nets are actually set in the water right in the wind farm area. Commercial fishing trawlers trawl parallel to the wind farm, and rod and reel, recreational and commercial fishermen fish right up to the pylons. The Block Island, so I guess the Block Island Wind Farm is living proof that offshore wind and recreational and commercial fishing can coexist. The Block Island Wind Farm, to achieve this, it wasn't really easy. There was a lot of research that occurred before, during, and after construction, and those would include fish habitat, acoustic, mammal studies, even social science studies to determine whether or not the visual corridor of a wind farm would upset tourism or real estate values on Block Island and other places on land that could actually see the wind farm. With all these studies, to date, there are no permanent adverse effects on fish or habitat to be found. So I'm an advocate of developing research and monitoring plans for wind farms like the Block Island Wind Farm had. And a recent example would be the South Fork Wind Farm, which is being built on Cox Ledge off Massachusetts in Rhode Island. And here, I was part of a group of commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen that worked together with the developer and scientists to develop a research and monitoring plan. Now, not every stakeholder got 100% of what they wanted, but yet this is a research and monitoring plan that all worked on together and is now in place. We also continue on wind farms. In addition to the Block Island Wind Farm, we learned from Europe. And most recently, European studies have shown that there is a greater abundance of finfish in wind farms than outside of wind farms. And this was a peer-reviewed study that looked at a number of peer-reviewed studies that took place in Europe. Any study that looked at wind farm finfish and then a control area outside. So this leads to my final point, and that is that offshore wind farm pylons create habitat and attract fish, much like reefs do. Underwater video taken of the pylons at the Block Island Wind Farm show mussel growth, small scup and black sea bass feeding off of that, and then larger fish, bluefish, and striped bass on the perimeter picking off those. So it's a great place to fish now. Divers actually dive and spear fish in this area, as well as rod and reel fishers. In conclusion, the fish that I catch today is much different than the fish that I caught 10 years ago. As we all know, the cold water fish, such as winter flounder, American lobster, is gone north or out to deeper and cooler water. And the warm water fish are here in greater abundance, like scup and black sea bass, for example. Charter captains in Rhode Island are running wahoo trips, which was unheard of. Wahoo is a very warm water fish. And just last week, the Rhode Island cobia wrecket, now cobia is an exotic warm water fish, was shattered. An angler caught a 56-pound cobia on the surface. And what was unique about this is that these fish were schooling on the surface. There was a whole school of cobia on the surface in Rhode Island waters. So this is quite unique. So I see the impacts of climate change on fish and believe we need to act today with offshore wind to help stem the tide on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And finally, we will hear from Hillary Bright of the Blue-Green Alliance.
Hi, everyone. Really good to be with you here this morning. Hillary Bright with the Blue-Green Alliance. The Blue-Green Alliance unites America's largest labor unions and most influential environmental organizations, aimed at solving today's climate challenges in ways that create and maintain quality jobs and build a stronger, fairer economy. Offshore wind offers an excellent example of BGA's mission. For instance, we've heard today about the possible climate impacts. Now I want to dive in a little bit to address some of the jobs and economic impacts. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory said the Atlantic coast states could create $200 billion in new economic opportunity, as well as over 43,000 high-paying permanent jobs simply by developing 54 gigawatts of the over 1,200 gigawatts of offshore wind energy potential. So lots of numbers in there, but overall, just taking a small portion of what is possible on the Atlantic coast, we're looking at very significant high-paying permanent jobs as well as economic investment. A full build-out of offshore wind potential could result in somewhere between 133,000 or 212,000 jobs per year in the United States. This is the kind of opportunity that can become a keystone piece of needed economic recovery, one that will help the working class recover from the economic pain caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. If we truly want to maximize the full potential of offshore wind projects, it's critical that they are built by skilled workers in trades like the utility workers, electricians, iron workers, and operating engineers that are paid family-sustaining wages with project labor agreements in place, agreements that include ports, installation and operation and maintenance, as well as the robust development of a domestic supply chain, with materials manufactured here in the United States by unions like the United Steelworkers. Offshore wind projects are extraordinary infrastructure feats with unique supply chain and workforce development opportunities. As we've heard, each project can employ hundreds, if not thousands, of local workers across a broad range of sectors. And because the components required, such as foundations and turbines, are so large, the manufacturing opportunities for key ports around the region are immense. In closing, I just want to highlight the numerous voices that have spoken today in support of increased offshore wind resources across the Northeast and the United States. From environmental advocates to business leaders to labor, health professionals, and recreational fishermen. We must transition to renewable energy, and offshore wind is a game changer. But our regional grid calls for a regional effort. New England can be at the forefront of offshore wind energy development in the United States and serve as the leading example of how to successfully implement an equitable roadmap towards carbon neutrality and combating climate change. Clean energy can outcompete fossil fuels. Forcing fossil power plants to close helps to reduce pollution that has negative health impacts on vulnerable communities. Combating climate change, driving economic growth, and making our communities healthier. Offshore wind can help with all of these challenges and present new opportunities. Thank you all so much for being here. And Susanna, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Hillary. And thank you everyone for taking the time to speak with us today and for your work in support of offshore wind across many different sectors. We will now be transitioning to questions from the press. We received a few questions ahead of time and we'll also be happy to take questions live, either in the chat box or verbally. If you do wish to ask your question verbally, please flag that in the chat box because there are a lot of people on here, so I can't see everybody's face. So please just indicate that you would like to ask a question verbally in the chat box. And so with that, we'll be moving to questions. So the first question that we have received is with regards to the election. Which is, will the presidential election tip the fate of offshore wind? We do acknowledge that stronger climate policy and federal leadership on climate would greatly benefit offshore wind, but we do not expect that this presidential election will determine the fate of the industry. Offshore wind is such a win-win for both the economy and the environment that we hope and expect that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, will issue a record of decision in the coming months that allows projects to move forward. Next question that we received in advance. We received a labor question. So Hillary, I'll direct this to you. Can you speak to project labor agreements or PLAs, and what do you mean by quality jobs, and how can we hold the offshore wind industry accountable to actually create them?
Excellent question. I think what we're talking about when we say quality jobs is the importance, one, yes, of the pay that people are making, but the permanence, the health benefits, the time off, sort of the package of employment benefits that we see in sort of in what we consider quality jobs that allow people, I think, as Senna said, to be able to live reasonably, respectfully, and safely with their families. I think project labor agreements come into play in that the employer and the workforce have the opportunity to come together and figure out what the best plan is, both for the workers, but also to do the work in a timely, safe, effective manner. And trying to hammer out some of those details on the front end really help with the efficiency of the project, which is critical in particular for offshore wind because of some of the other factors that can impact construction and installation. Really just the weather and things that that people come across when you're doing these projects. So I think laying out some of that on the forefront will help with the projects, as well as really the investment and understanding of workers across America, but certainly on the East Coast, that there is an opportunity for them in this space, and it can present the career pathway to support themselves and their families.
Thank you, Hillary.
Say something on that one too, Susanna?
Yes, go for it.
I think Hillary is right on about this, about developing a quality labor force, and certainly the unions through their apprentice programs in many of these specialized areas, I think particularly the IBEW, but across the region, they've demonstrated that they're ready to work with the industry, create good contracts, and provide the labor force. But it's going to be a much larger issue in how we provide the labor force, and particularly bring young people from our Career and Technical Education Center into this field. And, we're already facing some labor shortages in New England because of our demographics, particularly in northern New England. So it's going to take a great deal of cooperation. I think here's where the cooperative framework that's being set up here means that we can look at this as a regional challenge of which people can be trained where, and how our government's going to help support that education system as well. And just to reiterate too, this is such an extraordinary opportunity to bring communities into prosperity, and people who may have been shut out of job training and good jobs in the past, and that their areas have been adversely impacted by pollution or high energy costs. And what an opportunity this is through our labor force and job development to transform our economy.
Thank you, Senator Waters. We received a question from Colin Young at the State House News Service, who asks, what will it take to get to the point of a regional offshore wind procurement? Will each state have to authorize the regional procurement individually, and how far off might that reasonably be? So thank you for the question, Colin. We aren't necessarily advocating for explicitly cooperative procurements, but we do believe strongly that improved coordination and collaboration between our states, as well as higher procurement targets, will drive economies of scale and support planning and good outcomes across a range of regional challenges, including transmission, workforce development, which some folks have mentioned, equity, cost, ports and infrastructure, and more. Would any of my colleagues like to add anything to this response? Okay, we'll move to the next question. We received a question on offshore wind developers. So the question was, offshore wind developers are involved in other advocacy groups, but you don't see them listed as partners in this coalition. Is that by design? How would you describe your group's identity in this existing mix of offshore wind advocacy? So it is true that offshore wind developers are not partners in this coalition. We intend to be an independent group of advocates, and we'll work with stakeholders across the board, including offshore wind developers, but intend to be an independent group advocating for offshore wind in both the New England region and within states. Dan, I don't know if you are intending to add something. Just keeping track of these questions. The next question that we received, how can the US and the region streamline the permitting and implementation phase of offshore wind projects? This is certainly an excellent question and is another powerful example of why we need more regional collaboration to send a message to the federal government and to support states and towns in creating more common guidelines for developers and to accelerate responsible design and construction. So I'll just highlight the role of regional collaboration and what we are really advocating for there for the region to collaborate to help solve those challenges, but also to send a strong signal to the federal government for clear guidelines and rules on that. Another question we received are fishery concerns about offshore wind valid or obstructionist? How can the offshore wind industry get fishermen on board?
I'd like to respond after you.
Yeah, well, I'll just start by saying, as David said, that we support a robust stakeholder engagement process, and we believe that the ocean can be a shared energy resource. The leading threat to wildlife, including fisheries, is climate change. And as David said, describing some of the fish he's been catching in recent years, some of the waters off the coast of New England are some of the fastest warming waters in the world, including the Gulf of Maine. So we really must take urgent action to address climate change, and offshore wind is critical to that effort. David, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I'd like to add, not all fishers are opposed to offshore wind. Many recreational fishers are supportive because of the reef effect that it's created by the pylons. And I know that we hear a lot about cumulative impacts with multiple wind farms, and I think most folks think of that as negative. From my perspective, I think there could be huge positive cumulative impacts on recreational fishing. And just to put it in perspective, recreational fishing is quite important to the economy of the New England states. In my home state, Rhode Island, recreational fishing has a $420 million sales economic impact, according to U.S. Fisheries of the United States, which is published by NOAA annually. And commercial fishing has a $333 million impact. In Connecticut, it's about even. In Massachusetts, commercial fishing outstrips 2-to-1 recreational fishing. In Florida, it's off the charts. Recreational fishing is very important. So first of all, it's key to note that not all fishers are opposed. Moving forward, the research and monitoring plans that I mentioned, like the one I ported, like the two that I pointed to, one, the Block Island Wind Farm, and two, the South Fork Wind Farm, where stakeholders were all at the table. They figured out who fishes in the area, what do they catch, what kind of research do we need to safeguard the resource. And these are called research and monitoring plans. And if these are done in each wind farm, I think it would go a long way to facilitate buy-in from stakeholders.
Great.
Can I add something, Susanna, about to what David said? I think for the Gulf of Maine, we really have learned a lot from what Rhode Island and Connecticut and Massachusetts have done in the really complicated negotiations with the fishing industry. And that really helps us to understand that there has to be absolute involvement early of these stakeholders. I will say that as a member of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which regulates the fisheries from Maine to Florida, and seeing what is happening with the warming waters in the Gulf of Maine, that we really have to make sure that there's going to be opportunity for fishermen as these species, if we lose lobster, where is this industry going to find a new catch? And so I think that the climate issues are there. Certainly we're going to have to pay very careful attention to the right whales and in terms of sound. Maybe Habib has more to comment on this, but with floating towers and now moving to 9 megawatt, 11, 12 megawatt towers, there are going to be fewer of them, and with the cabling for the floating, you have run into perhaps fewer impacts on fisheries. And also, if we're very careful about how we onshore the power and make sure that we minimize the impacts there of those underwater transmission, I think we're going to be in a much better place in the Gulf of Maine on this issue.
Yeah, yes, Senator Waters said to follow up what you said is the advantage, of course, of floating is the fact that you can put these things far from shore, and you can go to areas where hopefully less fishing is taking place. So if you can go 30 or 40 miles away from shore, then you have a lot of areas to choose from and reduce impacts from that perspective. And of course, like as you said, the larger turbines, you have less of them, and therefore you have less interference and less. But to put things in perspective, as Maine, we ran some numbers for the state of Maine. If we were to just harness 3% of the offshore wind resource within 50 miles of the Gulf of Maine, we can heat every home in Maine and drive every car. Just 3%. So that kind of gives a bit of a perspective that there is an opportunity for all of us to work together. And what a coalition group like this needs to really can do is bring people together, the fishing industry across New England together in a real deep dialogue that will address their concerns and allow this industry to move forward. And that's really what's needed more than anything right now, is that dialogue. And I think we as a team here can be a positive force in bringing people together and starting this dialogue. So.
Thanks, everyone. And David, we had one follow-up while you were speaking. I'm wondering if you can take it. What do you make of the opposition and/or push for changes to offshore wind plans by the squid fishery, scallop fishery, and others in fishing?
I am not an expert on the subject, but I do think that everyone's concern really has to be listened to. And if research, it all should be science and research driven rather than anecdotal. So if the science is done to show that there are impacts and things can be mitigated so that offshore wind and commercial and recreational fishing can coexist, I mean, that's the path that we should go down.
Great. All right. I saw that Ben Martins, the CEO of Maine Coast Fisheries Association, is on the line and would like to ask a question. So, Ben, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, you guys. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm the executive director of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. We work with commercial fishermen, those guys who fish 30 miles offshore, who would be impacted by these types of projects. And I've got two quick questions for you. The first one is, what are we talking about when it comes to communication? This is really where we've seen a lot of these projects break down over time, is that it's communication that doesn't take place that really impacts and creates poor outcomes on the other side of the equation. I think most of the commercial fishing industry knows that offshore wind is coming. They want to make sure it's done the right way, and they want to make sure that minimal impacts take place on their way of life and the fish stocks. And so I would love to hear a little bit of talk around like how you have good engagement and communication. And then the other piece of that equation when it comes to the fisheries is roughly 25% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from our food system, and that segment of emissions is going to be growing as demand for high quality protein increases around the globe. And the best source for high quality protein that is low greenhouse gas footprint is our wild caught fisheries. And so are we in essence taking away access to sustainable wild caught fisheries that does help solve our climate problem by replacing it with energy production? So I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about those two issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate the questions. Amber, I can take a shot at this, but I'm wondering if you would like to step in and answer some of these.
Sure, and I'm seeing the questions in the chat box about birds. specifically as well, so I can just weigh in a bit across the board. So a lot of this, so I'm Amber Hewitt with the National Wildlife Federation. We launched our offshore wind campaign about 10 years ago, in large part because we believed in the immense unmatched scale of this resource as an opportunity to combat climate change, particularly in the Northeast region and in densely populated coastal states. But as a wildlife organization, we are only coming to the table for projects that we believe to be responsibly developed, responsible for marine and coastal wildlife and avian species. And a lot of that has to do with choosing the right location, and that comes from robust stakeholder engagement in the very earliest phases of the process when lines are drawn on a map. But we also have advocated for years, both at the state and federal levels, for stricter provisions to be set as a barrier to entry for developers. So regardless of I could talk specifically about any species, whether we're talking about fish or whales or sea turtles or birds. It's always important to have experts on every front of the table from the beginning, but then also to put in legislation or policies enabling offshore wind development, just a requirement of meeting the highest standards of best management practices informed by best available science at the moment of development. We are always learning. We're talking about launching a brand new industry. There needs to be immense monitoring pre, during, and post construction of these projects so that we can always be informing development going forward. And so legislation and regulation needs to reflect that every project needs to meet a standard that will always be informed by new science and new experience as we go forward. So certain states have done that. This is, again, another strong case for regional collaboration because wildlife off our shores are interacting with projects that are within, regulated by different states and different bodies. So really that should be standardized across the board. And I guess I'll leave it at that, but happy to go into further detail with anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Amber. And I'll just reiterate that stakeholdering is a really key priority for this coalition, Ben, and that's what we will be advocating for, as Amber says, as early and often as possible is really important. And again, as she mentioned, on this, especially deeper regional collaboration, which is one of our main goals, is really essential for this. As you know, fish stocks don't respect state boundaries or federal boundaries for that matter. So improving regional coordination on that, including stakeholder engagement, is really important. And I really appreciate your point about low carbon wild caught fish and the need for sustainable protein. This coalition recognizes that climate change is the single largest threat to the world's oceans and the world's food systems, but it must be built responsibly and in ways that coexist with other responsible ocean resources and uses. And we do that by stakeholder engagement. So thank you for your questions. We have six minutes. We're going to be cutting this off at 11, so everybody can get back to their busy days. So we'll try to slot in as many of the rest of the questions as we can. So next up, we have a question about the letter that I mentioned in my remarks about regional collaboration on offshore wind, the letter to the governors. And the question is, where can the news media obtain a copy of the letter to the governors? So we will send a follow-up message to news media outlets after this with the letter, so you will have it on hand. Let's see. All right, so I did see that there was a question about bird strikes, but Amber, you addressed that a little in terms of citing. The question was, what work is being done to address concerns about bird strikes? But I think mostly that's stakeholder engagement in what you spoke to, so. Move to the next one. The next one is, did you reach out to any commercial fishing industry groups to be part of this coalition? the answer to that is, to be honest, is no, but we look forward, just like with the offshore wind developers, we look forward to working with all stakeholder groups across the board, and if commercial fishing groups would like to work with us, we will welcome that. So we'll be implementing cooperative partnerships and relationships with all stakeholder groups across the board. All right, thank you. Any last questions before we close out? We just have a couple minutes left. We do have one other question about ocean zoning, and does ocean zoning work? Can't say I can speak to that in particular, but I think what Amber said about continuing to monitor and learn from this industry and really implementing, scientific monitoring and research will be really important to make sure that we keep track of that issue. Amber, I don't know if you have an answer to that as well.
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer the intent behind the question, but I will say that there's a lot of, when we start to talk about offshore wind power and it starts to be in the public attention, it usually reflects 5 to 7 years of discussion around exactly where to draw an area on a map for offshore wind development, and that is guided by and informed by inputs from every imaginable sector. And that there is always, I won't defend the process, there's always room for improvement, there's always room for better stakeholder engagement. And hopefully the more we talk about offshore wind, the more there will be interest in and participation in that process at the beginning when we start drawing new areas on the map. And I know there's a lot of effort underway around and conversation around ocean planning. It's something that we've always tried to plug into. There are certainly greater experts on the topic than I myself, but it is, I think it's just an area that as we talk about adding another significant use to the ocean, that the more we can focus on collaboration and shared use, and as you mentioned, just coexisting and thriving, the better. So I don't know, there may be others.
And I'd like to jump in if I could. Firsthand, I know that the Block Island Wind Farm, Rhode Island, as you know, were pioneers in ocean planning. And the wind farm was scheduled to be in a different location, but with input from commercial and recreational fishers, the wind farm was actually moved. I know that many years ago, I was looking at a proposed plan. At the time, I believe it was Deepwater Wind. Now Ørsted was developing the Cox Ledge wind farms, which is now Revolution, South Fork, etc. And there were temporary plans in place where the turbines would go, and it received huge amounts of commercial and recreational input. And those wind farms are where they are today with input. The thing is that things do change in the ocean, and commercial fishers and recreational fishermen always have a point of view, and it changes. So even though these wind farms had input from the start with fishermen, some may feel differently now. So I think it does work because it facilitates input from stakeholders.
Thank you, David. All right, it's 10:59. So this concludes the press conference for New England for Offshore Wind. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, speakers, for taking the time to speak with us. If you'd like to learn more, please keep an eye on our website. Elizabeth Henry just posted the link to that in the chat box, and follow the hashtag NE4OSW, which is the shorthand for New England for Offshore Wind. We will be continuing to collaborate across New England and urge our lawmakers to raise their ambitions and deepen collaboration across New England as well. And just to end, we also dropped my email address in the chat box if any of you have follow-up questions or need to contact me. And we will be following up with press after this press conference. So thank you all for coming. Look forward to working with everyone.
Thank you.